Chapter 4. The Story of the Bald-Headed Man. We followed the Indian down a sordid and common passage, ill-lit and worse furnished, until we came to a door upon the right, which he threw open. A blaze of yellow light streamed out upon us, and in the center of the glare there stood a small man with a very high head, a bristle of red hair all around the fringe of it, and a bald, shining scalp which shot out from among it like a mountain peak from fir trees. He writhed his hands together as he stood, and his features were in a perpetual jerk, now smiling, now scowling, but never an instant in repose. Nature had given him a pendulous lip, and two visible lines of yellow and irregular teeth, which he strove feebly to conceal by constantly passing his hand over the lower part of his face. In spite of his obtrusive baldness, he gave the impression of youth. In point of fact, he had just turned his 30th year. "Your servant, Miss Morstan," he kept repeating in this thin, high voice. "Your servant, gentlemen. Pray step into my little sanctum. A small place, miss, but furnished to my own liking. An oasis of art in the howling desert of the South London." We were all astonished by the appearance of the apartment into which he invited us. In that sorry house it looked out of place as a diamond in the first waters of the setting brass. The richest and glossiest of curtains and tapestries draped the walls, looped back here and there to expose some richly mounted paintings or oriental vase. The carpet was an amber and black, and so soft and so thick that a foot sank pleasantly into it, as if into a bed of moss. Two great tiger skins thrown athwart were increased by suggestions of Eastern luxury, as did a large hookah which stood upon the mat in the corner. A lamp of a fashion of silver dove hung almost invisibly golden wire in the center of the room. As it burned, it filled the air with a subtle aromatic odor. "Mr. Thaddeus Sholto," said the little man, still jerking and smiling. "That is my name. You are Miss Morstan, of course, and these gentlemen?" "This is Mr. Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson." "A doctor, eh?" he cried, much excited. "Have you your stethoscope? Might I ask you, would you have the kindness? I have doubts of my mitral valve. If you would be so very good, my aortic may rely upon, but I should value your opinion on the mitral." I listened to his heart as requested, but was unable to find anything amiss, save, indeed, that he was in the ecstasy of fear, for he shivered from head to foot. "It appears to be normal," I said. "You have no cause for uneasiness." "You will excuse my anxiety, Miss Morstan," he remarked airily. "I am a great sufferer, and have long had suspicions of the valve. I am delighted to hear that you are unwarranted. Had your father, Miss Morstan, refrained from throwing the strain upon his heart, he might have been alive now." I could have struck the man across the face, so hot that was this so callous the offhand reference to a delicate as matter as Miss Morstan sat down, and her face grew white to the lips. "I knew in my heart that he was dead," she said. "I can give you every information," said he. "But what is more, I can do you justice, and I will, too, whatever Brother Bartholomew may say. I am so glad to have your friends here, not only as an escort to you, but also as witnesses as to what I am about to do and say. The three of us can now show a bold front to Brother Bartholomew. But let us have no outsiders, no police or officials. We can settle everything satisfactorily among ourselves, without any interference. Nothing would annoy Brother Bartholomew more than any publicity." He sat down upon a low settee and blinked at us inquisitively with his weak, watery blue eyes. Wow. As for my part, said Holmes, whatever you may choose will say no and go no further. I nodded to show my agreement. That is well, he said. May I offer you a glass of Chianti, Miss Morstan? Or of Tokay? I keep no other wines. Shall I open a flask? No. Well, then, I trust that you have no objection to tobacco smoke, to the balsamic odor of the Eastern tobacco. I am a little nervous, and I find my hookah to be an invaluable sedative. As he applied the taper to the great bowl, and the smoke bubbled merrily through the oars water, we sat there in the semicircle, and with our heads advanced and our chins upon our hands, while the strange, jerky little fellow in his high, shining head puffed uneasily at the center. When I first determined to make this communication to you, he said, I might have given you my address, but I feared that you might disregard my request and bring unpleasant people with you. I took the liberty, therefore, of making an appointment in such a way that my man Williams might be able to see you first. I have complete confidence in his dissertation, and he had others, if we were dissatisfied to produce no further in the matter. You'll excuse the precautions, but I am a man of somewhat retiring, and I might even say refined taste, and there is nothing more unaesthetic than of a policeman. I have a natural shrinking from all forms of rough materialism. I seldom come in contact with a rough crowd. I live, as you see, with some little atmosphere of elegance around me. I may call myself a patron of the arts. It is my weakness, the landscape of a general cut, and what the connoisseur perhaps might throw a doubt upon the Salvator Rosa, there cannot be in the least question of my bourgeoisie. I am partial to the modern French school. You will excuse me, Mr. Sholto, said Miss Morson, but I am here upon your request to learn something which you desire to tell me. It is very late, and I should desire the interview to be as short as possible. At the best, I must take some time, he answered, for we have certainly have to go to Norwood to see Brother Bartholomew. We shall go and try to get the very better of Brother Bartholomew. He is very angry with me for taking the course which has seemed right to me. I had quite high words with him last night, and you cannot imagine what a terrible fellow he is when he is angry. If we are to go to Norwood, it would perhaps be as well as we start at once, I ventured to remark. He laughed until his ears were quite red. That would hardly do, he cried. I don't know what he would say if I brought you in that sudden way. No, I must prepare you by showing you how we stand to each other. In the first place, I must tell you that there are several points in the story of which I am myself ignorant. I can only lay the facts before you as far as I know them myself. My father was, as you may have guessed, Major John Sholto, once of the Indian Army. He retired some 11 years ago and came to live in Porchenderry Lodge in Upper Norwood. He had prospered in India and brought back with him a considerable sum of money, a large collection of valuable curiosities, and a staff of native servants. With the advantages, he bought himself a house and lived in luxury. My twin brother Bartholomew and I were his only children. I very well remember the sensation which they caused with the disappearance of Captain Morstan. We had read the details in the papers, and knowing that he had been a friend of our father's, we discussed the case freely in his presence. He used to join in our speculations as to what could have happened. Never for an instant did we suspect that he had the whole hidden secret of the own breast. That of the men he alone knew the fate of Martha Morstan. We did know, however, that some mystery, some positive danger overhung our father. He was very fearful of going out alone, and he always employed two prize fighters to act as porters in Portionberry Lodge. Williams drove you to tonight and was one of them. He was once lightweight champion of England. Our father would never tell us what it was he feared, but he had the most marked aversion of men with wooden legs. On one occasion, he actually fired his revolver at a wooden-legged man, who proved to be a harmless unman canvassing his orders. He had to pay a large sum of hush to keep it up. My brother and I used to think a mere whim of my father's, but events have since led us to change our opinion. Early in 1882, my father received a letter from India which was a great shock to him. He nearly fainted at the breakfast table when he opened it, and from that day he sickened to his death. What was in the letter we could never discover, but I could see that it held some sort of written in scrawling hand. He had suffered for years from an enlarged spleen, and now had become rapidly worse. And towards the end of April, we were informed that he was beyond all hope, and that he wished to make less communication to us. When he entered his room, he was propped up on his pillows and breathing heavily. We besought to lock the door and come up to either side of the bed. In grasping our hands, he made a remarkable statement to us, in a voice which was broken such as emotional by pain. I shall try to give you the word in its very own words. I have only one thing, he said, which weighs upon my mind at this supreme moment. It is my treatment of poor Morson's orphan. The cursed greed which has been my besetting sin through life has withheld her treasure, half of at least which should have been hers. And yet I have made no use of it myself, so blind and foolish a thing is avarice. The mere feeling of possession has been so dear to me that I could not bear to share it with another. See that chaplet tipped with pearls beside that quinine bottle? Even that I could not bear to part with, although I hadn't got it out of the design of sending it to her. You, my sons, will give her a fair share of the Angler treasure, but send her nothing, not even the chaplet, until I am gone. After all, men have been as bad as this have been recovered. I will tell you how Morson died, he continued. He had suffered for years from a weak heart, but he concealed it from everyone. I alone knew it. When in India, he and I had come into a remarkable chain of circumstances, came into possession of a considerable treasure. I brought it over to England, and on the night Morson's arrival he came straight to me as if to claim his share. He walked over from the station, and was admitted by my faithful old Loud Chowder, who is now dead. Morson and I had a difference of opinion as to the division of the treasure, and we came to heated words. Morson had sprung out of his chair in a paroxysm of anger, when he suddenly pressed his hand to his side. His face turned a dusky blue, and he fell downwards, cutting his head against a corner of the treasure chest. When I stooped over him, I found him dead, and to my horror. For a long time I sat half distracted, wondering what I should do. My first impulse was, of course, to call for assistance, but I could not but recognize that there was every chance that I would be accused of his murder. His death at the moment of a quarrel, and the gash of his head would be black against me. Again, an official inquiry would have made without bringing out some facts of the treasure, which I was particularly anxious to keep secret. He had told me that no soul upon earth knew where he had gone. There seemed to be no necessity why any soul should ever know. I was still pondering over the matter when, looking up, I saw that my servant, Chowder, was in the doorway. He had stolen and bolted the door behind him. Do not fear, Sahib, he said. No one need know that you have killed him. Let us hide him away, and who is wiser? I did not kill him, said I. Machado shook his head and smiled. I heard it all, Sahib, he said. I heard you quarrel, and I heard the blow. But my lips are sealed. You are asleep in the house. Let us put him our way together. And that was enough to decide me. If my own servant did not believe my innocence, how could I hope to make it good with the other 12 foolish tradesmen in the jury box? Machado and I disposed of the body that night, and within a few days the London papers were full of the mysterious disappearance of Captain Morstan. You will see from what I say that I can hardly be blamed on the matter. My fault lies in the fact that we concealed not only the body, but also the treasure, and that I have clung to Morstan's share as well as my own. I wish you, therefore, to make restitution. Put your ears down to my mouth. The treasure is hidden in. At this instant, a horrible change came over his expression. His eyes stared wildly, his jaw dropped, and he yelled in a voice which I would never forget. Keep him out! For Christ's sake, keep him out! We both stared round at the window behind us and saw where his gaze was fixed. The face was looking in at us from the darkness, but we could see the whitening of the nose pressed against the glass. It was a bearded, hairy face, with wild, cruel eyes and an expression of consented malevolence. My brother and I rushed forward to the window, but the man was gone, and when we turned to my father, his head had dropped and his pulse had ceased to beat. We returned to the garden that night, but found no sign of the intruder. Just under the window, a single footmark was visible in the flower bed. But for that one trace, we might have thought that our imaginations had conjured up a wild, fierce face. Very soon, however, had another and more striking proof that there were secret agencies at work all around us. The window of my father's room was found open in the morning, and his cupboards and boxes had been rifled, and upon his chest was fixed a torn piece of paper, with the words, the sign of 4, scrawled across it. What that phrase meant, and who our secret visitor may have been, we never knew. As far as we can judge, none of my father's property had been actually stolen, though everything had been turned out. My brother and I naturally associated this particular incident with the fear which haunted my father during his life, but it was still a complete mystery to us. The little man stopped to relight his hookah and puffed thoughtfully for a moment. We had all sat absorbed listening to the extraordinary narrative. At the short account of her father's death, Miss Morstan had turned deadly white, and for a moment I feared that she was about to faint. She rallied, however, on drinking a glass of water which I had poured out of one of the Venetian crafts near the side table. Sherlock Holmes leaned back in his chair, an abstracted expression, and his lids drawn together in glittering eyes. As I glanced at him, I could not but think how that very day he had complained bitterly about the commonplaces of life. Here at least was a problem which would tax his sagacity to the utmost. Mr. Thaddeus Sholto looked from one to the other of us in obvious pride at the effect which the story had produced, and then continued between the puffs of his overgrown pipe. My brother and I, he said, were, as you can imagine, much excited for the treasure that my father had spoken of. For weeks and for months we dug and delved into every part of the garden without discovering its whereabouts. It was maddening to think that the hiding place was on his very lips in the moment he died. We could judge the splendor of the missing riches in the chaplet which we had taken out. Over the chaplet my brother Bartholomew and I had given little discussion. The pearls were evidently of great value, but he was averse to part with them, for between friends my brother was himself a little too inclined to my father's fault. He thought, too, that if we parted with the chaplets, it might give rise to gossip, and finally bring us to trouble. It was all I could do to persuade him was to let me find out Miss Morstan's address and send her the detached pearl at fixed intervals, so at least she might have and never feel displeasure. It was kindly enough, said our companion earnestly. It was extremely good of you. The little man waved his hand deprecatingly. "We were your trustees," he said. "That was the view in which I took it, though Brother Bartholomew could not altogether see it in that light. We had plenty of money ourselves, and I desired no more. Besides, it would have been such bad taste to have treated a young lady in such scurvy a fashion. La mauvaise grâce minia al crime. The French have a very neat way of putting things. Our difference of opinion on this subject went so far as I thought it was best to the rooms myself. So I left Pondicherry Lodge, taking the old Crittmager and Williams with me. Yesterday, however, I learnt that an event of extreme importance had occurred. The treasure has been discovered. I instantly communicated with Miss Morstan, and it only remains for us to drive out to Norwood to demand our share. I explained my views last night to Brother Bartholomew, and so, to be expected, it was not welcome visitors." Mr. Thaddeus Sholto ceased, and sat twitching on his luxurious settee. We all remained silent in our thoughts upon the new developments which the mystery business had taken. Holmes was the first to spring to his feet. "You have done well, sir, from first to last," he said. "It is possible that we may be able to make some small return by throwing some light upon that which is still dark to you. But Miss Morson remarked just now it is late, and we had best put the matter through without delay." Our new acquaintance was deliberately coiled up with the tube of his hookah, and produced from behind a curtain a very long befrogged topcoat, with an astrakhan collar and cuffs. This he buttoned up tightly. In spite of the extreme closeness of the night, he finished his attire by putting on a rabbit-skin cap with a hanging lappets which covered his ears, so that no part of him was visible save his mobile and peaky face. "My health is somewhat fragile," he remarked, as he led the way down the passage. "I am compelled to be a valetudinarian." Our cab was waiting outside, and our program was evidently prearranged, for the driver steered off at once at a rapid pace. Thaddeus Sholto talked incessantly in a voice which rose high above the rattle of the wheels. "Bartholomew was a clever fellow," he said. "How do you think he found out about the treasure was? He had come to the conclusion that it was somewhere indoors, so he worked out all the cubic space of the house and made measurements everywhere, so that not 1 inch would be unaccounted for. Among other things, he found that the height of the building is 74 feet, but on adding together the heights of all the separate rooms and making every allowance for the space between, which he ascertained were by borings, he could not bring the total to more than 70 feet. There were 4 feet unaccounted for. These could only be the top of the building. He knocked a hole, therefore, into the lath and plaster ceiling of the highest room, and there, sure enough, he came upon another little garret above it, which he had sealed up and was known to no one. In the center of the room the treasure chest, resting upon 2 rafters. He lowered it through the hole, and there it lies. That computes the value of the jewels at not less than 500,000 sterling." At the mention of this gigantic sum, we all stared at one another open-eyed. Miss Morstan could secure her rights. We could change from a needy governess to a rich heiress in England. Surely it was the place of a loyal friend to rejoice at such news. Yet I was ashamed to say that selfishness took me by my soul, and that my heart turned as heavy as lead within me. I stammered out a few halting words of congratulations, and then sat downcast, with my head drooped deaf to the babble of the new acquaintance. He was clearly a confirmed hypochondriac, and I was dreamily conscious of he was pouring forth interminable strains of symptoms and imploring information as to the composition and actions of innumerable quack nostrums, some of which he bore about in a leather case in his pocket. I trust that he may not remember any of the answers which I gave him that night. Holmes declares that he overheard me caution him against the great danger of taking more than 2 drops of castor oil, while I recommended certain of large dosages of a sedative. However, that may be. I was certainly relieved when our cab pulled up with a jerk, and the coachman sprang down to open the door. This Miss Marston is Pondicherry Lodge, said Mr. Thaddeus Sholto, and he handed her out.